video, who I think are the two most likely head football coaches to get fired in 2025. So number one is Mike Norvell from Florida State. So Florida State last season probably had the biggest drop off I've ever seen a team have, going from 13 and 0 in the regular season, one spot away from making the four-team playoff, to a 2-10 season, and the worst team in the horrible ACC conference, and probably the second worst team in the Power Four. And this has started to make me think that Mike Norvell is actually not a very good football coach, and that the two good years that he had at Florida State, he just got lucky with the transfer portal. Now, I think motivation was an issue with Florida State last season. I do not think they had the same motivation going into 2024 as they did going into 2023. Because I think Norvell and the players that came back from the 2023 team were still focused on missing out on the 14 playoff the year before, and not near as focused on the 2024 season as they should have been. And Florida State's offense was the big problem with them last season. It was like non existent. And of course, it was a mistake for him to bring in that DJ ukulele to play quarterback. He was terrible, and of course, he ended up getting hurt, and they weren't any better at quarterback or on offense after he got hurt. But it wasn't just the quarterback; the wide receivers were terrible, and the running backs were terrible, and the offensive line was terrible. And their defense at times looked okay, but it wasn't near as good, of course, as it was in 2023. But this season, Florida State really needs something of everything, really, even a new head coach. Now, Norvell did bring in two good coordinators. But if he's not a very good head coach, it's probably not going to matter. And he's obviously going to have to do much better this next season than he did last season to have any chance of being able to keep his job. And number two is that Mike Gundy from Oklahoma State. So Mike Gundy came so close to losing his job after last season, but I'm glad he got to keep his job because he's only had two bad seasons in the 20 seasons that he's been Oklahoma State's head coach. And last year was the first time since his first season there that Oklahoma State missed a bowl game. But to me, Oklahoma State was probably the most disappointing team in the country last season, because I was higher on them than I was on Florida State. Oklahoma State made me look pretty dumb last season, because I picked them to win their conference and get a bye in the college football playoff, and then they finished last in their conference with zero conference wins at 3-9. So with what went wrong last season for Oklahoma State, obviously their defense was horrible, and they did have some injuries on defense. But their defense was not very good in 2023, and they still won 10 games. The big thing that went wrong with them was their offense. Their offense was not very good, and it should have been really good. Ollie Gordon didn't have near as good of a season as he had in 23, and Oklahoma State's offensive line, that was the exact same offensive line that blocked for Ollie Gordon when he won the award for the best running back in the country, was really bad for some reason. And that quarterback that came back last season was terrible and ended up getting benched. And it really seems like there was poor coaching with Oklahoma State last season. Now, Mike Gundy has completely redone his staff, but he hasn't brought any great assistants in that I know of. But obviously, he's going to have a lot of improvement this coming season for him to have any chance of being able to keep his job. But I wouldn't count Gundy out because he's actually had most of his good seasons when Oklahoma State hasn't had high expectations. And number three is Lincoln Riley from USC. So Lincoln Riley, I think, is under big pressure because of all the money he was given to go be USC's head coach, and now he's had two disappointing seasons in a row. He's going to have a much better record, I think, uh, this coming year than he had in 2024 for him to be able to keep his job. So, in 2023, USC was expected to be a team that had a really good chance to make the four-team playoff, and they, only went 8-5. And of course, then you would have thought maybe that was just a fluke season, because that was his only average season as a head coach. But then in 2024, they were even worse. They finished at 7-6. Now, the defensive coordinator that he brought in seems to have been a good hire. That was the best defense that he had ever had since he's been a head coach. But the problem was they also last year had the worst offense that he's ever had since he's been a head coach. Their offensive line was not any better than it was in 23, but they didn't seem far off, really. They lost a bunch of close games, and at times, like when they beat LSU, they looked really good. And I'm higher on that new quarterback, Jaden Mayava, now after watching what he did in the bowl game than I was before that. But the defense should continue to get better with that Deanton Lynn now as the coordinator. But the question is going to be the offense if it can get back to how it usually has been with Lincoln Riley. If so, I think he'll probably keep his job. But if not, I think he'll probably end up getting fired. And number four is Brent Venables from Oklahoma. So Venables is on my list because Oklahoma, has always been one of the best college football programs. In two of his three seasons there, they've been 6-7. Now I get the first year when they went 6-7 was just his first season as a head coach anywhere, and then in year two he had them much improved to 10-3. But then after that, he was expected to continue to be successful, but then just went right back down to 6-7. Now, I do know last year that he was dealing with a bunch of injuries on the offensive line, and they didn't have any of their good wide receivers for most of the season. And I see why he would get another season because he has improved Oklahoma's defense. They actually had a good defense last year, and at times it even looked great. It looked like the kind of defense that they would need to be able to be competitive in the SEC. But their offense was so horrible, and it's going to have to be much better next year for him to have a chance to get a fifth season as Oklahoma's head coach. Their offense was one of the worst in the country and the worst in the SEC. They and I think for Venables to get to keep his job, Oklahoma will need to win at least 9 games next season. But I would expect him to keep the defense being solid. And really, the Navy loss was really bad for Venables because I don't care that it was just by 1 point. They had no business losing to Navy, and he really lost that one all by himself because Oklahoma hadn't done anything offensively in the game other than the first quarter until at the end when they were somehow able to put together what would have been a game tying scoring drive that would have put the game in overtime. But then Venables decides to go for two instead of kick the extra point, and he should have known that as bad as Oklahoma's offense had been all season, that they had pretty much no chance of making that 2 point conversion. But number five is Hugh Freeze from Auburn. So Hugh Freeze has had two losing seasons as Auburn's head coach. He's 11-14 overall. And I didn't expect Auburn to be that good last season because of that Peyton Thorne was coming back at quarterback, but I did expect them to be a little bit improved, but they were even worse. They missed a bowl game and finished just at 5-7. And Hugh Freeze is a decent coach, but he's one of those coaches that to have a good team, he's got to have a good quarterback. He's not one of those coaches that can win a lot of games with an average or a bad quarterback. And what he did in the transfer portal last month makes me wonder if he doesn't actually even want to be at Auburn. He got Jackson Arnold from Oklahoma to be their quarterback next season, who was the worst quarterback in the SEC, even worse than Peyton Thorne was. So Hugh Freeze, I think, will need to win at least 8 games next season to be able to get a fourth season, and I don't see that happening with Jackson Arnold. I think he's now ruined himself. He can try harder, it seems like, to get himself fired. So number six is Luke Fickell from Wisconsin. So Luke Fickell was supposed to be a good hire for Wisconsin because of the success that he had at Cincinnati, but it hasn't worked out that way. And I usually believe in giving a coach 3 years before considering making a change. And this will be Fickell's third season at Wisconsin. And if they're not any good this coming season, I think it'll be time for them to make a change. So in year one that Fickell was there, Wisconsin had high expectations, but I didn't really believe it. I thought it would take more time, and that was true because they were not very good. They were only 7-6, but in year two, I was actually pretty high on Wisconsin after I looked at their roster. But then they were just even worse and finished at 5-7 and missed a bowl game for the first time in 22 years. And Fickell has tried to make Wisconsin's offense more balanced instead of just being a running team, but it hasn't worked out. Their offense has been terrible both years that he's been there. And number seven is Jeff Lebby from Mississippi State. So, of course, me being an Ole Miss fan, I've enjoyed these last couple of years seeing Mississippi State struggle so much. But I get that it was Lebby's first year last year as a head coach anywhere, and that he didn't have a good roster. But anytime that you go 2-10, you're going to be under some pressure the next season. And Lebby did improve Mississippi State's offense a little from what it was in 23, but their defense was terrible, one of the worst in the country. And I expected him to improve their offense a little, but I also expected their defense to be horrible. And Mississippi State, has always at best been an average football program, but they've shown that they can be impatient because of what they did with the coach before Lebby. And he's already lasted longer than the coach before him. That coach that they hired before Jeff Lebby didn't even get to coach an egg ball. They fired him after just 10 games, and he had a better record in that than Lebby had in his first season there. But for Lebby to be able to keep his job, I think he's at least going to have to get a couple more wins than he got in year one. And at number eight is Billy Napier from Florida. So I would have thought that Billy Napier would be off this list because I would have thought a year ago that he would have been fired. But he did do a lot better than I expected him to do last season. He did have a strong finish, uh, getting wins over Ole Miss and LSU and winning his last four games, and they finished at 8-5. But I still don't think that Billy Napier's job is safe at all. And I do not think that he's a very good football coach because Florida is one of the top three states in the country for high school football talent. And in his 3 seasons as their head coach, he only has one winning season and has lost at least 5 games in every season. So now I think he's going to be expected to win at least 9 games, or he's probably going to be fired. And then number nine is Kalen DeBoer from Alabama. So I've got Kalen DeBoer on the list because of the high expectations at Alabama. I don't think he's actually a bad coach, but I don't think he's a great coach. And I know that most football coaches that went 9-4 in their first season would be in no danger at all of getting fired, but Alabama expects at least 10 wins every season. And of course, I know Jalen Milroe was not a great quarterback, but Nick Saban almost won the national championship with Jalen Milroe playing quarterback. And Alabama's offensive line was not as good last season, and their defense was still top 10 in the country, but it was not as consistent as Nick Saban's defenses were, and that was really the case with the offense too. It was not near as consistent, and it's not like Kalen DeBoer just lost to really good teams last season. He lost to three unranked teams, and other than Nick Saban's first season at Alabama, he had one loss to an unranked team. But Kalen DeBoer, I think, is going to have to go at least 10-2 next season to be able to keep his job. And I've looked at Alabama's roster recently, and I think they could have a really good team next year, depending on how well they do at quarterback. And that's, I think, going to determine if Kalen DeBoer gets a third season at Alabama, how well he can develop Ty Simpson or whoever Alabama's next quarterback is going to be. And then at number 10, I've got Kyle Whittingham from Utah. So Kyle Whittingham is on this list because of how high he's raised the expectations at Utah because he's had all of those good teams. But last season was not one of them. They were one of the most disappointing teams in the country. Utah was the favorite to win the Big 12 last season, and they finished 5-7 and second last in the conference. And Kyle Whittingham had considered retiring after last season, but he decided to come back for the 2025 season. And Utah's defense was still solid last season. just not as good as it was before. It was the offense that was the real problem for them. And I know Cameron Rising got hurt again, but they didn't have him all year in 23, and Utah still won 8 games. But I saw they are moving on from Rising. He's no longer on the roster, which I think is the right thing to do. And Kyle Whittingham is only number 10 on my list, really, because I think that he's probably going to get Utah back to being a good team next year. It's just a feeling I have, not really because I've looked at the roster and think that they're going to be great. But that will be it with this video. Please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon.